Hey everybody, we've got George Santos. He's not going to run for re-election next year, and he might even be expelled in the near future. Today on Political Access, we're going to cover some of the recent stories over the past week. We've got a lot of retirements. We've got Nikki Haley, San Francisco, the Supreme Court, and we'll finish it off with some elections. So I'm going to try to go quickly through this, and the first thing is George Santos. The scandal-plagued freshman Republican from New York was previously defiant about stepping down, and he was even going to run for re-election. But now that the House ethics panel has played out, it's not a surprise, but it found that Santos has kind of done some things that were less than proper. So now the heat is actually building on Santos. He realizes he would be almost certain to lose a primary next year, but now we don't even know if he's going to finish out this term. I would assume there's going to be a floor vote on it. Would there be enough votes to expel him if he's already not going to run for re-election? I don't know. I would say it's a possibility. I haven't looked into where all the Republicans would stand. It's assumed all the Democrats would vote to expel Santos, and I know the Republicans are working with a thin majority. They don't really want to lose one of their own, but at the same time, if Santos is now some sort of a confirmed serial liar, they might not want to be attached to that as we start rolling into primary season next year. So we'll see what happens with that. Somehow Santos got in there without anybody digging into his past. That's embarrassing in of itself. Then whatever's happened subsequently, I can't even really begin to follow all of it, but it looks like Santos's fate is now sealed. Now, if you want to move on to other retirements, we've got another one in Virginia. Abigail Spanberger. She's calling it quits next year, and instead she's going to focus on running for governor in 2025. Now, she is from a blue-leaning district in Virginia. It could flip to the Republicans under the right circumstances, but I would expect that to be a hold for the Democrats. As for the governor's race, that's almost 2 years away. It's too far to make any real predictions. I would assume she'd be a strong candidate in a Democratic primary, but a lot of what happens in that race I think is going to depend on what happens in the presidential election next year. If Trump wins it, then I would say that it's fairly likely that's going to flip toward the Democrats. If Biden wins it, then Republicans might have a decent opportunity to hold that seat in a post-Glenn Youngkin era. If you want more retirements, we've got another one here. Dan Kildee from Michigan's 8th. He's not going to run next year either. He's been in there a while. His name is well known in Michigan, and Republicans have had their eye on Kildee's seat for a little while. On paper, it is kind of a swing district, but the GOP hasn't really had any success there. It is a different map after redistricting, and with Kildee's name not on the ballot, there's no question Republicans are going to go after this seat. If it's a red-leaning environment and they have the right candidate, that's certainly on the table for a pickup opportunity. But Democrats are really going to want to hold that, especially because Kildee won by 10 points last time. But it doesn't stop at Dan Kildee. We've got another one. Longtime Democrat Brian Higgins from New York. He's not only going to not run for re-election next year, he's apparently going to resign in February. His district covers the Buffalo area, and there's almost no chance that district is going to flip toward the Republicans. But Higgins, who cites dysfunction in Washington as his reason for stepping down, will vacate that seat. That's likely to mean the Democrats will be short a member and trigger another special election. Those are just some of the recent retirements. If we get on Wikipedia, we could take a look at the rest. A lot of these I've already covered, and most of them are in safe districts. Some of the other ones I haven't really mentioned on this channel. We've got John Sarbanes in Maryland. Jeff Jackson, I did mention he is running for Attorney General now in North Carolina. About Earl Blumenauer in Oregon and Derek Kilmer in Washington. Those districts are not really in any danger of flipping, but the retirements are starting to pile up. And for the Republicans, Debbie Lesko in Arizona's 8th, she's hanging it up next year as well. That's going to be an interesting primary for the Republicans. We've got Blake Masters running for that seat. Also in Colorado's 4th, Ken Buck. He's not going to be running again either. We've also got Brad Wenstrup in Ohio, Kay Granger and Michael Burgess both in Texas as well. Most of the other ones I've mentioned at some point, but that's a flood of retirements here now that we've gotten into the fall and past the November elections. I'm sure there's going to be a few more that trickle in, and given that most of these are safe seats, the focus then does shift to the primaries. For the Democrats, it's are they going to go establishment or progressive, and for the Republicans, it's are they going to go establishment or more in a Trump direction. We'll have to just wait and see what happens, but let's move on to Nikki Haley. I could have pulled up any number of sites about this, but here's an editorial from Politico. You probably already heard about this, but essentially Haley was talking about in order to combat misinformation online, that anonymity should not be allowed. You should have to have yourself verified with your name, and somehow everything is supposed to be great after that. Well, it does look like she suffered some backlash. I think she tried to walk it back a little bit, and this is kind of the last thing Haley needed as she was rising in the polls in recent weeks. And maybe this really doesn't have much of an impact, but it seems like this has very little appeal on both sides of the political aisle. If you cannot be anonymous or have a pseudonym online, that would be limiting in so many different ways. days. Plus, people talk about how it's unconstitutional. That type of thing I think is always going to be up for debate depending on the judges. But I just think the American people would not really be a fan of that. I think in some sort of utopian sense, it does sound good that if everybody just walked around with name tags on and all the other problems in the world would just work themselves out. I think that's naive, even if it's well-intentioned. I think that was a misstep on Haley's campaign. Next, let's go on to San Francisco. I was hearing a lot about this story. There was a gathering of some important high-ups in the Bay Area, and that included the president of China. And who cares about that? Well, in recent years, San Francisco has kind of been known for its homeless population, possibly also its crime and its dirty, but somehow magically, the tent cities and the filth just disappeared right before this important event. So a lot of people are wondering, how could this happen? Where did everybody go? Well, Governor Newsom did say it is partly at least because of this event, and I think there's two parts to the controversy. I think the progressive side says just moving these people in dire situations out of the way, that's not solving anything. But I think the broader reaction to this is, if we can clean up the city and get homeless off the streets, why were we not doing it before this? It takes some gathering with international elites to make it happen? That is a slap in the face of everybody who lives in that area. And of course, just moving them a few streets over or whatever they did, that is not going to solve anything. It is nice to have the streets cleaned, maybe get some of the garbage and the needles off the street, but it does seem pretty outrageous that almost everybody agrees is a chronic problem, but somehow with the wave of a wand, something seemed to happen, and whether you agree with it or not, I think the motivation behind that something was for the wrong reasons. Let's move on to the Supreme Court. They've adopted an ethics code. You can read about this here in this New York Times article. I glanced over what the code involves. I'm sure a lot of it is obvious and makes sense. Some people say it does not go far enough, and other people seem to say that there's really no way to enforce this. And I think both of those are kind of true. To me, it seems more like an advisement, and if one of the justices violates it, there might not be an explicit penalty, but then that's going to create more public pressure on the U.S. Senate, possibly to go in an impeachment direction. I think that's the ultimate goal of this. So it's something everybody should be on the same page now with the Supreme Court and ethics. Them writing their own code might seem a little bit cheesy, but I guess something is better than nothing. Now let's go on to some elections. Tuesday, we've got a special election for the U.S. House in Utah's 2nd Congressional District. It would have been great if this took place on November 7th with the rest of the elections, but we've got a general election between Celeste Malloy, the Republican, and Kathleen Reeby, the Democrat. You might remember the primary, that was pretty contentious. The general election is supposed to be less contentious because the district itself is fairly red-leaning. Trump won it easily in 2020, and if you come down here, we've got a link to a debate here. I actually did watch most of this debate, and my reaction was neither of these candidates seemed all that enticing. It was a little bit too low-key, a little bit too much stammering for me, but either way, we got one poll here. It's not extremely recent, but Malloy is up by 9, and if you look at this general election ballot, there's actually 7 candidates on here, and a lot of people might say Democrats have overperformed in special elections. There's a small chance Democrats could flip this. That would be a major upset if it happened, so Republicans don't want to be complacent there, but they're expected to hold this seat, and it should technically be easily over 10 points. Last, we've got Louisiana, and we've got some runoffs. The main event for governor already happened. Jeff Landry won that outright, but the other races that did not have somebody hitting 50%, there is a runoff on the 18th. That's tomorrow. I believe the most notable races are Secretary of State and State Treasurer. There's also some in the state legislature. So if you're into runoff elections, take a look at Louisiana. It's a pretty red state, not expecting anything crazy to happen, but that's a look at some of the stories over the past week. There's a lot there, but let me know in the comments, what do you think about any of these stories? How about Santos? Is he going to get expelled? What about all these retirements we've seen over the last couple of weeks? What about Nikki Haley? Do you think she's done for? And what about San Francisco and them magically cleaning up the city? And the Supreme Court Code of Ethics? And what about the elections? Any chance for an upset in Utah or in Louisiana? Let me know down below. On your way out, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.